Yeah, so this is joint work with my colleagues. It's U Boulder, Abteen Ebrahimi, Chris Stenzel, and Alexis Palmer. And if you look at this title, maybe the first thing you would think is why high resource languages for language documentation, right? Like, what is this? And let me explain this to you. And I can probably best do this by telling you the origin of this paper. And what happened was, since we're all at U Boulder, we were having a picnic together. It was like our opening the semester picnic. And Alexis and I were talking to Chris. And Chris basically said she had been working with indigenous languages in Brazil, and she had collected all this data, and she's a linguist. So she told us, now she has this data, and like it's a huge resource, and she has basically the indigenous language and the translations into Portuguese. But now she's in the US and nobody understands the Portuguese, so it's basically super useless to people in the US. And so she's trying to translate it. Let's see if I have this. So she's trying to translate this by hand from Portuguese into English. And then, so she's not that old, but she was like, maybe I can't finish this before my life is over, basically. And we were like, wait, have you thought about just using automatic translation for this, right? Because it's Portuguese, English seems pretty straightforward. But Chris had actually never really heard of this. So she was like, is this really something you can do with NLP? And so we're like, yeah, it's like between Portuguese and English, right? It seems pretty straightforward. We can probably do this. And then she was like, okay, that's perfect. We said, okay, just give us whatever Portuguese text you have and we can totally translate this into English. No problem, we give it back to you. And then after we said this, we actually thought about it. We're like, can we really do this? And this is where this paper basically happened. So the question is, can we really translate this Portuguese into English automatically? So in terms of what Stephen was talking about earlier, this is pretty much in the camp of NLP actually helping the linguist. And then in terms of what Antonius was talking about, this is not very technical, but I think it's a very nice application and in the end showing that NLP can actually be really useful to linguists. So the reasons why we ended up being unsure if this was possible is like, first, the data that Chris is working with is out of domain with respect to the MT systems training data, right? So it's like conversational, it's talking potentially about topics that are not that popular in most popular MT systems training data and so on. Yeah, did conversational. And then the existing translation, so the Portuguese text basically, contains like non-standard uncommon expressions, often reflecting properties of the documented, so the indigenous language, just because like that's the translationese that happens when you translate. And the data also includes borrowings from other regional languages, so like words that are not actually really like Portuguese words. So before we go into systems, I want to talk to you shortly about the actual language being documented. So that's Cotidian. And yeah, it's also going by the name Manano. And it's an East African language spoken like in the basically Brazil and Colombia. And Chris was working like at the Brazilian side of the border. Yeah, and this documentation description of the language has been ongoing since 2000. Mostly by Chris and her colleagues, actually. And yeah, so this area, because it's Brazil, right, is mostly a Portuguese-speaking area, which is why in the first place, the language was translated into Portuguese as opposed to, like, for example, English or maybe Spanish. And yeah, I wanted to show you this short video of Chris because she can actually explain all the documentation effort way better than I can.
I'm Stenzel, and I conducted work on description documentation of economic languages in the Upper Rio Negro region for over 2 decades. The Upper Rio Negro region spans some 200,000 square kilometers of the Brazil-Colombia borderlands in northwestern Amazonia, and it's home to some 67,000 people. My most recent documentation project from 2017 to 2020 focused on documentation of language use in everyday life among the Cotidian and Waikana language groups. However, because of the multi-ethnic and multilingual makeup of villages and families, our recordings also involve speakers of other languages such as Tucano, which is now the dominant regional lingua franca. In total, this last documentation project gathered some 250 hours of raw recordings, most of which were recorded by members of our Indigenous research teams. The corpus of transcribed and translated data, which we will be archiving at the Endangered Languages Archive in Berlin, has about 60 hours of data, including some 20 hours of sociolinguistic interviews. The existing translations of this extremely complex material from the Indigenous languages into Portuguese were done by multilingual members of our Indigenous teams using Elan software. So I've been able to add in English translations to only a small part of this data. So getting help from machine translation is an enormous benefit, even if there is still some fine tuning to be done. Briefly, our database is composed of 3 types of interactional data. The largest being conversations that occur in the course of activities in everyday situations like meetings. We also have some recordings of pairs or small groups of people engaged in interactive tasks. These are designed to stimulate commentary or focus on specific semantic categories. And I already mentioned our sociolinguistic interviews, which were conducted by members of our research teams in the Indigenous languages and with pairs or groups of speakers. So they also constitute a body of primary interactional data focused on speakers' perspectives on their own multilingual experiences. So overall, this is a unique documentary corpus. There's no corpus of this type for any language groups in this region. And in fact, documentation of interaction is pretty rare overall in Amazonia. So we're very anxious to be able to analyze it further and also make it more accessible to other researchers. I believe that working with Katharina and the rest of the team should help tremendously in making that possible.
Okay, and I also wanted to show you actually one of the recordings that Chris has made, or part of it, not the entire thing. Okay, yeah, so this is roughly the data we're talking about. So it's not so much like just one person being like narrating like a story or something. Yeah, this is the Elan or part of the Elan file. So we have here the Cotiria text in the upper box, and then the lower box we have the Portuguese translation. And then what we want to do is basically produce the same thing, but in English. The machine translation systems we tried were state-of-the-art systems. So of course, we're interested in like what can the best we can do now do in the setting. So the first one was Google Translate. I think we probably all know this, right? Commercial MT system and so on. The second one was MBART 50. That's a transformer system that's like first trained as an autoencoder and then fine-tuned on parallel data. And we have also M2M 100. Yeah, so transformer sequence to sequence model for like 100 languages. And the main part of our work here was an actual like in-depth evaluation of the systems. So we evaluated in 2 ways. The first way being automatic evaluation. We all know it's not that great, right? But everyone does it and it's fast and it can give you a first idea of a system's performance. And the second one was manual evaluation. So here we actually looked at the data in detail and like went through every single like translation and so on. So that's our main contribution. And of course, this also provides just a better idea of noteworthy things that are happening than the automatic scores can. So for the automatic evaluation, we used BLUE, which looks at word overlap, and character F score, which looks at character overlap. But more importantly, for the manual evaluation, we did 2 things. So we annotated the meaning of the sentence. So here we asked, so the meaning of the Portuguese sentence, right, accurately reflected. And we also had the Cotiria sentence. We cannot really do that much with it. So one here means, well, the meaning of the translation has absolutely nothing to do with gold or is misleading. So in some cases we had something where like the words were like roughly similar, but then it could just have the opposite meaning or something, right? So that counts as a 1 because it's just wrong. Like we can't really use that. And 5 is basically exactly the same meaning. And the second thing we looked at was something we called relative fluency. Because like fluency or like grammaticality is typically just like, is this a grammatical sentence? But here we said, okay, it's fine if it's like as grammatical as the reference, right? Because sometimes people just don't use grammatical sentences, like probably me in this talk like a million times. So here are the results of the automatic evaluation. So 3 systems, Google Translate, MBART, MTM 100, and we get like a 20 blue score for Google Translate and then like around 10 for the other 2. So here there's a clear gap, right? We can see Google Translate here, according to blue, clearly does the best. Now 20, like if any of you work on machine translation, you know 20 is like not that good actually, but it's like, it's fine, right? It's not that terrible, but state-of-the-art systems for like in-domain text can usually do much better. Character F score, the same picture. So Google Translate is still much better than the other 2 roughly at the same level. So looking at the manual evaluation, interestingly, we get kind of the same picture. So maybe like they're not that bad as proxies. Here, meaning on the left, we see again, like Google Translate is way better than the other 2. MTM 100 a bit better than MBART, but we also didn't care that much because Google Translate was like clearly the winner here. And for relative fluency, still Google Translate best, but everything's way closer together. So we thought, okay, apparently one thing we can learn here is that all systems are able to somehow produce fluent text, right? Okay, good. That's at least nice. In absolute terms, what we see is that things are close for Google Translate, close to 4. So like, thinking about it, like a 4 was kind of like, yeah, that's a good translation. So actually we thought, yeah, this seems like this is actually really, really usable, right? So we never expected a 5, like that would have been absolutely mind blowing, but a 4 is like, yeah, pretty solid. So yeah, actually in the end, we ended up using this. So we actually translated like the rest of Chris data with this because we said, okay, 4 is convincing enough, like needs some hand corrections, but it's usable. And yeah, then looking at the actual examples, we found a couple of things. So we did this only for Google Translate because it was the best system. We found a couple of things it was really struggling with. So still the conversational / dialogue speech. So here, for example, we have the reference, which is yeah, thrown away, and tomorrow we can kick them in. And the Google Translate, yeah, play, tomorrow we're going to break with kick. So I mean, they're both kind of like without context, hard to understand, but the last one is really like, you have no idea what this even should mean, right? So yeah, Google Translate didn't do a very good job here. Then transfer from the language being documented. So here what happens is, this should mean to São Gabriel, but in Portuguese, we have M here as the preposition, because that's the literal translation of the word that's used in quotidian. But then Google Translate translates it literally, ends up with in, even though it should be to. Yeah, and then again, like lexical borrowings from other regional languages are often not translated correctly. So we also found a couple of surprising strengths. So for example, sometimes the Portuguese data had like something that's more like a note to the reader, more or less. So here in parentheses, we have actually it's like sadness or like angry. And you could expect maybe a translation system gets thrown off by this and then like kind of is totally confused, translates something totally random. But this did not happen. So Google actually translated it well and then also translated the annotations, which weren't even in the reference. So yeah, this was really well done. And we also had reduced forms, like here we had pra instead of para, and Google Translate could handle this. So that was kind of nice too. We had a couple of ideas for further improvement. So maybe not Google Translate, but another MT system. Yeah, like you could imagine to do some model adaptation to like this documentation setting. So for example, like English translations or translations like into English. from documentation corpora of other languages could familiarize the model with like this conversational like type of English, or potentially recurrent themes like travel, food, ceremonies, and so on. Or what we thought is you could go even into more like fine-grained kind of detail and train on parallel data between the documented language and the first high resource language. So in this case, this would basically be translating between Cotidia and Portuguese, and like fine-tuning on this to like go directly into the words that are used in this setting. And yeah, we also thought that incorporating knowledge about key structural properties of the language being documented, so Cotidia here, could potentially help. Okay, so the key takeaways are really like MT is good enough to usefully assist with the translation between two high resource languages in a language documentation setting. There's still challenging phenomena like conversational speech, transfer from the language being documented, borrowings, but there are also surprising strengths. And if you're interested in looking at the data, so you can find the data Chris produced at Elan and our train dev test files here. Okay, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Katharina. It was a great talk, and this documentation process is really important. And so we've got time, like 3 minutes for questions. Okay. So I wanted to ask a question. Well, perhaps it's what you said about the borrowed words from other languages, but I still wanted to ask if there were like many words connected with the local culture, which were perhaps hard to translate into English just because they refer to some cultural concepts which are specific for the area. Or perhaps some material things or some, I don't know.
You're asking if the words were like not translated because they were like very specific, basically?
Yes, like the thing this woman was doing with the rope, I don't know. Perhaps it has some name in the language which lacks like in English.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's missing, but it's like, I think usually if it's like a typical thing kind of. But I also like, I don't want to say that I know entirely like which words are borrowed. So yeah, that would be something that we would need to look at.
Yeah, so perhaps some like names of the species which are characteristic of the region, like animals and fishes.
I think it's also sometimes like specific, like really like things. But yeah.
Oh, okay. Perhaps there are other questions.
Yeah, so there's one person in the room.
Could you please come up?
Hey, I don't know either. Thank you for the presentation. So my question is that this is amazing. We have a similar problem, which is translating textbooks and grammars, which would share many of the same challenges. It's not as colloquial as what you have here, but you would also get the mixing of the two languages, mixing of related languages. You would get definition of cultural terms which will not be available. In the project, in addition to translating the ELAN files themselves, have you translated any textbooks for, because maybe there's like Portuguese language textbooks for people to learn the language. Do you have any experience in this kind of translation?
So I think the setting would be that you have a Portuguese, like a textbook that is basically in Portuguese for learning Cotidia, and then you want to translate it to English.
Yes.
No, we haven't looked at it, but it's definitely a very fascinating application. So if you want to do that, we should talk about it.
Yeah, no, it's a problem that we have, and it's taking forever. To translate, we have a textbook in Spanish and the language, and we try to put it in English. And yeah, no, we're facing many of the same challenges.
Yeah, no, but in general, I definitely think that MT can help with this. So have you tried it?
Yeah, no, I mean, we're using Google Translate basically, but we find many of the same issues that we have with.
Okay, so you just have the, yeah, we can talk about, maybe we can do some work there on like how to improve it. Okay, one more person.
Okay.
Or I don't know, you're going to move on or you want to ask a question?
Yeah, no, I ask a question.
Okay.
Have you maybe thought about a way to automatically detect pieces to translate that might be harder, just to focus automatic translation on easier parts to translate?
Not in that context, but I think it's a very good idea. Yes, agreed.
Yeah, that's very nice. Let me thank you again for your great presentation.